Chapter 11. The Cave. Joe's issue stood before the yellow spring in contemplation before turning back to the way he came. The devil made work for idle hands. All the time lazying around at the jows had apparently made him jump down here without a thought. Huashan's sex patriarch was no honorable type, but his son was even worse, having indulged in debauchery at such a young age. Besides, they were all pugilist wanderers. Being attacked was all in a day's work. No matter where Tianji was severed, his head or his family jewels, it didn't concern Joe's issue in the slightest. It might have been for Wen Kexing's ghostly tales, but he suddenly had a bad feeling. The underground cave carried a sinister atmosphere. Joe's issue calculated, since he only had 2.5 years left, it was better to help the dying and injured, making the best of his time to do good. Not crawling into a grave with a man who was not always right in the head. But when he was tracing the way back, there was an abrupt thud, like a mechanism being switched. Around the entrance, hundreds of steel knives extended from the wall, blocking the path. Joe's issue was fortunate to have retreated in time, or else he would have been skewered. He frowned, staring at those knives, then looked at Wen Kexing. "Who did you offend?" The surprised question left Wen Kexing's eyes wide open. He looked like he was greatly wounded by the words. "Why is it that I had to offend someone for this to happen?" Joe's issue scoffed and shook his head. He had no choice but to move forward along the yellow spring. It was possible that he could find another exit somewhere. "Are you saying it's because of me and not you? I'm virtually unknown and have just entered Zhonghu recently. I have never committed thievery. The only thing I have been doing is traveling in peace. Who could ever hold a grudge against me?" Wen Kexing fell into silence, having enough of his companion's bold-faced lies. After a while, he spoke with a gentle voice. "You escorted Zhang Chengeling. You have killed 32 in total along the way, including 4 of the extremely dangerous type like Qin Song." "My ass, there are only 11 at most." Joe's issue replied, "Those in the shrine died under your little maid's hands. So it's still definitely you." Wen Kexing held out his hands. "These hands of mine, ever since I left home to join Zhonghu, they have not been stained with any blood, even that of a chicken, much less a human. How can it be possible that I have offended anyone?" Joe's issue didn't spare him a glance. That prompted Wen Kexing to walk faster, standing in front of the other with an exaggerated expression of seriousness. "It might be hard to believe because of how I look, but I swear I'm a good person." Joe's issue nodded. "Of course, Mr. Good Person Wen. Now that it's clear I'm just a murderous demon, it's better for you to get out of my way." Wen Kexing seemed to ignore the half-hearted nature of the response as he still wore a blinding smile. "I will leave you alone once you admit that you're wearing a disguise." Joe's issue smiled back. "How generous of you. Please, don't mention it." Joe's issue sidestepped him to go forward. Wen Kexing followed 2 steps behind, still smiling. The water of the spring flowed quite rapidly. Joe's issue kicked a rock down there, but it was unable to see the true depth. It twisted and turned in a complicated pattern, and there also seemed to be fish, but they swam too fast to be visible. Joe's issue was not good at swimming. The best he could do was holding his breath for a long time underwater so he would not die instantly upon jumping down. After examining, he decided it was better to stay away from it. The cave seemed to connect to many paths at all directions, since the sound of their footsteps and conversations could travel real far. Suddenly, Joe's issue stopped walking. "Brother Wen, look." Wen Kexing followed his gaze to a pile of bones not too far away. He mumbled, "Shouldn't the path to the yellow spring be lined with equinox flowers? And the dead should only have their souls left. Why are there bones here?" Joe's issue flicked at the bones, holding up a half-destroyed skull on one hand and the matchbook on another, sizing it up carefully. This skull was crushed. The part where it connects to the spine seems to be slashed. No, the wound is uneven. There are teeth marks here. Did an animal bite them? Can an animal bite someone's head off? Wen Kexing asked. Joe's issue picked up a thigh bone. Teeth marks. More teeth marks. They're quite small. He was hit with a sense of familiarity, as if he had seen them before somewhere. But he had never been a corner one, so the memory slipped his mind at the time. Wen Kexing felt his stomach churning a little, taking the thigh bone from Joe's issue with only 2 fingers. "This is quite a clean work we've got here, even cleaner than me gnawing on chicken bones," he said after examining. Joe's issue decided to stop having chicken drumsticks from now on. Who could have left such bites? Can it be a wild beast? Wen Kexing thought about it for a bit. "I heard that in the underworld there is this giant beast called Ting. Do you know if it likes meat or not?" It was clear that he still hadn't given up on his ghost stories. Joe's issue put on a fake smile. You just have to wait until you're 100 years old and leave this world to go down to hell. He didn't get to finish as there were sounds of water sloshing behind them. In the dark cave, the sounds made their hair stand on end. Zhou Zishu and Wen Kexing turned to that direction and took one step back, facing the small river with their guard raised. Wen Kexing spoke slowly, I also heard that Di Ting doesn't live in the Yellow Spring, and there aren't that many, either. Out from the river crawled many human-looking creatures, but not really. Their limbs were extra long and their stature was short. They were completely naked, their flesh pale from being underwater, and they had very long hair. Their body width was unnaturally large, twice or thrice that of a normal human. Their eyes shone a distant light while they gradually drew closer. Zhou Zishu looked down and bit his wrist, then spoke to Wen Kexing while staring at the faint teeth marks. I remember it now, those small marks are. Are what? Wen Kexing asked while retreating. Human teeth. Wen Kexing halted after that, coughing, fixing his hair and clothes. He made a salutation at the approaching monsters. My good brothers, we barged into this place completely by accident, we didn't at all mean to offend, so please. Zhou Zishu snorted in an uncharming way. The humanoid monsters let out a ghastly howl before coming at Wen Kexing. Wen Kexing yelled indignantly, I haven't finished. In contrast, he dodged the attackers like a flying leaf, moving to the side without any effort. The monster's reflexes and movements were fast as they immediately changed direction to chase after him, claws extracted and glinting, leaving marks on the ground that were about 2 inches deep. Zhou Zishu smiled. How is it, Brother Wen, are you speechless? The monster's attack officially began. Zhou Zishu wouldn't treat those like humans as they were definitely far from it. Their durability was unfathomable and their destructive power was immense. They were also fast and didn't seem to experience pain. Zhou Zishu's hand was on one's chest, attacking it with all of his might. A rock would have exploded after that move, but as the monster was knocked flying back against the wall, they only screeched before standing back up. Zhou Zishu was internally unsettled, he couldn't think of what it actually was. He heard a crack beside him. It turned out to be a sneak attacker being caught and having its neck snapped by Wen Kexing. Wen Kexing smiled, now I've saved you once. Zhou Zishu also realized in contrast to their firm body mass, the monster's neck was incredibly fragile, unable to support its head at times. He was surprised that Wen Kexing found out so quickly. Despite that, he replied with politeness, thank you. Another one barged at them, which Zhou Zishu evaded. His elbow curved to strike at the monster's back, and his fingers made a clawing movement to twist the neck. They made light work of taking down a few more. At least those creatures still had a bit of intellect in them, as they grew fearful after not being able to subdue their prey. Their leader howled, and they slowly returned to the water. Randomly, one would have its head above the water, staring at their abnormally powerful intruders. Zhou Zishu whispered, with their size, they can clearly bite our heads off. We shouldn't stay here any longer, let's go. Wen Kexing replied after a bout of contemplative silence, I've figured it out. Zhou Zishu presumed he had found out what the monster was. Figured out what? He asked without thinking. Real human skin will redden if you pinch it, since I can't make out your disguise, can you let me pinch your face a little? Zhou Zishu walked away, not bothering with an answer. He must have been mad for having taken this person seriously. Wen Kexing followed him close behind. Did I finally get you, and because of that you don't want me to touch your face? I knew it, I knew you used some kind of tricks. Are you so beautiful that you're afraid some sleazy deviants will be after you? No worries, Brother Zhou, I am a completely righteous and honorable individual, I'll never do any harm. So, can you let me see your true visage? Zhou Zishu turned a deaf ear with incredible restraint. But then Wen Kexing changed his tone. Although, your skills are truly no joke, I can't think of anyone who can be that good. Are you from the fabled Tian? Zhou Zishu stopped walking. In the darkness of the cave, Wen Kexing's smile seemed to carry another meaning to it. But Zhou Zishu only held up his index finger to stop the other, voice lowered, can you hear it? They went quiet. In the deeper part of the cave echoed the roars of a beast. It's the one that can bite off a human's head. Wen Kexing had no interest in those beasts, his eyes were fixed on Zhou Zishu alone. The man didn't react to his earlier words at all, only listening to his surroundings intently, his eyes and expressions never wavered. Another roar can be heard, significantly louder now, as if the beast had moved closer. Zhou Zishu saw the underwater monsters all cowering in supposed fear. He tugged at Wen Kexing, and they took a turn into another trail. Zhou Zishu took out a small bottle, sprinkling something along the way. Then they hid in a corner and held their breath. Chapter 12. Illusions. Wayne Kexing had no idea what the dust that Zhou Zishu had sprinkled was, but he didn't ask, as if he already knew what the other was capable of. He stood beside Zhou Zishu silently. Seconds later, the heavy breathing of the slowly approaching beast could be heard. The creature seemed to have noticed something, maintaining a slow tread. It went by a spot that was about 10 feet away from them. The creature was dog-like but as big as a pony, black all over. It panted through the nose, and in the air was a faint fishy smell. It slowed down even more, sniffing the air like it was suspicious of something. Zhou Zishu crossed his arms in front of his chest, leaning on the wall, eyes narrowed, watching the scene intently. There was a fleeting hint of a smile on Wayne Kexing's face. It was chilling and only there for a split second. The beast was not far away, but it had yet to notice the two's presence. It stood still for a while, then moved forward, being watched by two pair of human eyes. It followed the smell of blood to the corpses of the underwater monsters. After sniffing, it bellowed, head lowered and mouth chewing happily. It truly was able to decapitate the humanoid monsters. Wayne Kexing and Zhou Zishu glanced at each other. Zhou Zishu was quietly terrified. While he wasn't a corner, he had been through a lot in life and his knowledge was vast. It was impossible that he couldn't recognize a human head. Is that creature really human? He mused. If it was, how did it come to this? Wayne Kexing poked at him, pointing at a small road. Zhou Zishu nodded, leaving carefully. The road widened and narrowed in an unpredictable fashion. After an unknown amount of turns far away from their starting point, Wayne Kexing asked, "There are other teeth marks on the bones of those dead monsters. Do you think they cannibalize?" When he wasn't talking nonsense, his voice was low, almost like sighing with no strength to it, as if he didn't want to waste energy, completed with a hint of indifference. He paused, then continued, "Are they human?" Zhou Zishu looked at him, voice also low, "Forgive me, I'm just a fool with shallow knowledge." Wayne Kexing laughed softly, "You, shallow knowledge? Ha!" He didn't ask further and kept walking. After an indefinite time, at another turn, when the rapidly flowing yellow spring appeared again in front of their eyes, Zhou Zishu called out, "Wait." Wayne Kexing looked back at him, his irritating demeanor making a return. "What's wrong, beautiful brother Zhou?" Zhou Zishu knew all too well that reacting would only goad the other on, so he ignored the gibberish. Those underwater creatures are incredibly strong and fast, and they can move in the water naturally. The beast we saw walks on land and is aware that it has to stay away from the river. If it doesn't hunt near the water, how can it catch the monsters? Wayne Kexing stopped walking, examining the ground under them. It was unclear whether he was monologuing or speaking to Zhou Zishu. How big is this place? Why did it feel like the road was never ending? Zhou Zishu suddenly spoke after falling into pensiveness. "This river flows from east to west. I remember the direction very clearly. Even though we took a few turns, we're still going in the north-south direction." "You mean we're running in circles?" Sudden enthusiasm took over Wayne Kexing. He blinked. "I also heard about this one story where a person..." Zhou Zishu turned his back to him, making a mark on the wall with his fingertip, then wordlessly left to walk along the mysterious river. Wayne Kexing didn't mind his ghost stories being ignored. He rubbed his nose, following the other with a smile. Suddenly, they heard a roar that seemed to shake the whole cave. In the middle of it was a piercing scream that possibly belonged to a child. Zhou Zishu stopped walking. The child's miserable crying began to get louder. Zhou Zishu swiftly dashed to that direction. He was 10 feet away in just a blink of an eye. Wayne Kexing didn't get to say what he wanted to, his extending arm hanging in midair. He swallowed back the words, shaking his head and following the other. They saw under the claws of the half-dog, half-horse creature was a little girl. The big fangs were right next to the girl's pale neck, seemingly about to bite down. Zhou Zishu propelled himself higher in the air and struck down at the monster. Ranged attack was one of his fortes, and the creature was hit right in the head, its whole body knocked and rolled to one side. He picked up the child who was only weakly breathing. The beast shook its head with all its might, as if it was disoriented after being hit. After a moment, it realized that Zhou Zishu had stolen its food and roared, charging toward him. Throw her to Wayne Kexing by instinct, but then paused. His feet started to move around in a strange pattern, his body mysteriously able to retreat several feet away. He put the girl down and kept moving. The beast followed. The stench from its bloody mouth was headache-inducing. Zhou Zishu jumped to a high place before landing himself on top of the beast in just seconds. Wayne Kexing stood there, completely disregarding the crying girl with an expressionless face. Zhou's issue used the fall of 8,000 weight to keep the beast down, but it was a smart creature, its body toppling over to roll. If someone were to roll with it, they would be crushed to dust even if they were made of metal. Zhou's issue immediately took advantage of that to jump down with a shout, kicking at its belly. The creature's back was full of tough muscles, but the stomach area was really soft, and the kick nearly turned over every organ inside. It roared in pain, but could still stand up thanks to the thick skin's protection. Its mouth widened to bite at Zhou's issue. Its back legs were incredibly strong, and despite being in agony, it was still very fast. Zhou's issue was about to dodge when his internal strength suddenly hit a wall. The beast's sharp teeth were right in front of him at that moment. He pressed down at his chest with one palm and bent the elbow of the other arm, risking his life facing the attack to hit his elbow at the creature's nose. There was a sound of its nose being broken, its claw tearing Zhou's issue's left shoulder, making him bleed instantly. Zhou's issue realized the nose was the creature's weakness. He ignored his wound, using his hand to strike at the beast's nose again with enough momentum to completely shatter the bones on its forehead too. It staggered a few steps and went down with a loud rumble. Zhou's issue frowned, blocking the acupuncture points on his shoulder to stop the bleeding. He was about to use the water from the yellow spring to clean the wound, but then remembered the half-human half-demon creatures down there and gave up the idea. He heard Wen Kexing let out an "Oh." Then, "Do you have internal injuries?" Zhou's issue turned his head to glance at the other and replied calmly, "Just haven't had enough food tonight." Then he bent down to pick up the young girl, patting her back and speaking to her with a gentle voice, "Where are you from? How did you get here?" Wen Kexing laughed mockingly at that. "You should rather ask her what kind of demon she is. Why did you save her anyway?" The girl didn't say anything, only burrowing herself deeper into Zhou's issue's embrace. Zhou's issue stopped asking, saying to Wen Kexing, "For gathering merits." Wen Kexing stared at his bloody shoulder in deep thoughts, then suddenly smiled. "I've caught you, Brother Zhou forgot to disguise the skin on your shoulder. That area looks really different from your face and neck." Zhou's issue only paused for a few seconds before answering curtly, "It's because of sunbathing." Wen Kexing was still smiling. "Is it really? This is the first time I've heard that a pale beauty can have a haggard shade of skin after sunbathing." Pale beauty. Zhou's issue was given the heebie-jeebies after those words. Still carrying the girl, he was about to say something when his eyes caught something and saw a strange scene. On the body of the dead beast, a plant sprung up, glowing then blooming. "It's a cherry blossom tree." Wen Kexing followed his gaze, his face quickly paling. Zhou's issue had no time to care about that. He stood stock still, gawking at the still growing blossom tree. In the air was an unknown fragrance. The body of the dog-like beast was nowhere to be seen, and the flowers kept blooming as though absorbing magical energy. Soon, it spread out wide, seemed like he could even touch it if he had reached out. Then there was a person standing under the tree. He was a young man with thick brows and big eyes, full lips, seemingly always smiling. Blossom petals fell on his shoulders, but he cared none about it, only extending his hand, lips moving. Zhou's issue could make out what he was speaking, "Senior brother." It was Zhao Zhao. At that moment, it was possible that his heart had stopped beating. There was sudden sharp pain on his shoulder. Zhou's issue cried out, having lowered his guard. He looked down to see the little girl in his arms opening her mouth to sink her teeth into his wound. He acted on instinct and used internal strength to throw her off. When he pulled himself together, the cherry blossom tree and the person disappeared. In front of him now was only the dark cave with the beast's corpse on the ground and the pile of bones that they had examined moments ago. The girl that he threw off let out an inhuman scream. When he looked clearly, she was not at all a human girl, but actually the underwater monster. The little monster screamed with its mouth open, staring at his bleeding wound hungrily. It was eager to pounce again, but suddenly a hand stuck out and grabbed its neck. The creature didn't even get to struggle before its neck was snapped and it died immediately. Wen Kexing lips curled in amusement, discarding the body without a thought. He spoke as if nothing happened. "Those underwater things still dare go on land even when they're afraid of the beast. Seems like there aren't just us two down here." All strength seemed to have left Zhou's issue. He forced out a laugh. "Did we just go in circles and back to the original spot then?" Wen Kexing sized him up. "Can you walk? I can carry you. Bridal style is completely alright too, as long as you let me see your real face." Zhou's issue smiled dryly, "Thank you, but there's no need." He covered the shoulder wound, lifted his spirits and continued walking along the yellow spring. Then he asked like he just remembered something, "Back then I saw a tree with flowers growing from the beast's corpse, with princess feathers too jumping and singing. What did you see?" Wen Kexing replied from behind him, "I saw an owl, I told you before that owls laughing will only bring bad luck, and I was right, wasn't I? Then I also a person carrying a bowl with red water, and the owl knocked it over. Josishu kept his mouth shut. He told a lie. It was fair that his companion told a lie in return. He took the lead and didn't look back, so he didn't see Wen Kexing's expression at that moment. The smile on the man's face seemed to freeze there for a long time and his eyes were blank. It was unclear that he was looking down at the ground or at something very far away. Seeing that Josishu had no patience for his owl story, he swallowed it down and followed the other. Chapter 13. Exposed. Josishu abruptly stopped walking and sized up the 4 cave entrances with a frown. There's water and wind in here. The chances for someone to poison us are low, he said. He wouldn't call himself an expert in medicine-related matters, but the current emperor during his years as crown prince used to be acquainted with a young shaman from South Xinjiang who was held hostage at the capital. The shaman was following orders from the Shaman Valley to use the pugilists seen in Zhongyuan as test subject for their medicine, and most of the South Xinjiang originated remedies and poisons which were unheard of at that time were brought here by him. Josishu might not possess an intensive knowledge, but he had seen enough to know that there had yet to exist a poison that could cause hallucination for this long. Wen Kexing nodded. So someone has used divination to find ways to trap us here. Do you know anything about it? Josishu replied calmly. The stuff's about 3 directions, 8 trigrams and 6 jayas? You must have studied a lot of things, even this. Wen Kexing said in surprise. Josishu was nonplussed. Of course I don't, that's all I know about it. He decided to sit down as walking further was an impossible feat. While leaning back onto the wall, he carelessly let the wound graze the surface. He shivered and slightly grimaced, unable to process the fact that a mere wild beast could agonize him to this state, but such was the life of being seen as a nuisance everywhere he went. Wen Kexing thought about how he at least knew what 3 directions and 8 trigrams actually was and felt a sense of intellectual superiority, but after he remembered that Josishu sold himself for 2 silvers, the superiority fell flat. So he sat down beside the injured man, tilting his head to look at the wound, somewhat delighted at the other's misfortune. Serves you right for treating a monster like a little girl. Josishu closed his eyes to recuperate, paying no attention to him. Wen Kexing silently stood up, walked away and returned after a while. Josishu felt a spike of coldness on his shoulder, and he opened his eyes to Wen Kexing using a soaked piece of cloth to wash the wound. On instinct, Josishu avoided the touch, but Wen Kexing held back his shoulder. Don't move. Josishu asked with a pained face, where did you get the water from? The river. Wen Kexing replied. After some thinking, he added, it's running water, really clean. Josishu felt his hair stand on end. He knew it was running water, so drinking from it was no problem, much less using it to treat injuries, but he couldn't stop thinking about those underwater creatures roaming around under there. Sharp-eyed Wen Kexing happily teased the other after noticing the goosebumps. Can you really be disgusted when you look like a ragged beggar yourself? Come on, stop acting like a maiden. Josishu knew the other had a point. Nevertheless, he glanced at the other's handkerchief withering. The fragrance from it, a gentle and elegant smell of beauty products, attacked his nostrils, and at the corner was a small but exquisitely embroidered ornament. The size was a bit too big, and it looked too plain for a maiden to use, but if this was a man's, what kind of person would carry this on them? He couldn't help but give Wen Kexing a weird look and tease the man back since no one was around. My good friend, why are you carrying a maiden's belongings? Is there a story behind this? Wen Kexing, who was carefully removing the blood-stained fabric from the open wound, immediately tore the clothes with more force after hearing that, face blank. Josishu let out an ow, grimacing. Only then did Wen Kexing answered in good spirits, this is a personal gift from the famous courtesan and gentleman Su Yue from Yangzhou City. You shouldn't have asked if you don't want to make an ignorant fool of yourself. Then he continued to tear Su Yue's gift into pieces and used them to cover Josishu's wound. Josishu had no idea people from Jiangnan were that open-minded. He asked without thinking, because even back when the capital was 30 miles from the Wangyue River and was ruled by that degenerate emperor, the concept of a male courtesan was not heard of anywhere. Wen Kexing looked at him with pity. Were you born in Utopia? Is everyone from Tian a country bumpkin? Or was my guess wrong? Josishu scoffed, never have I said that I. Before he could finish, Wen Kexing moved at lightning speed to dig at a major acupuncture point on his chest. If the target was at another place on his body and was covered by clothes, Josishu would not feel anything, but he was exhausted and the unruly nails were acting up, so that very light attack was the last straw. He cried out, body bent over in pain, you. Wen Kexing rubbed his chin, his tone knowing, your internal injuries are very serious, and seeing how capable you are, there's no way Tian will let you go easily. But from what I heard, the deadly reputation of the nails of 7 apertures for 3 autumns is no jokes, yet I see that you can still behave normally and run around in great spirits. Even if you act a little silly, that silliness definitely isn't caused by the nails. Did I really guess wrong after all? Zhou Zishu gritted out while sweating buckets. Wen Kexing, screw your entire ancestors. Seeing that the man stopped putting on an act with all of his blah 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 brother when whatever nonsense, Wen Kexing felt accomplished even though he just got cursed at. He replied nonchalantly, my ancestors are just dust now, I don't even know their names, so that might be an impossible feat. Though, if you can remove your disguise, and under that is a stunning face, I'm perfectly willing to be a replacement for my forebears. Zhou Zishu was still gritting his teeth tightly, body wound up like a shrimp and trying his best to keep the nails under control. At the other's ramblings, he interrupted in irritation, would you shut the fuck up? Wen Kexing shut up immediately, crossing his arms and watching by the side with not a single ounce of guilt. After an undecipherable amount of time, Zhou Zishu opened his bloodshot eyes. Even though outsiders could not see what his real expression was, it was clearly not pleasant. It's morning now. The nails had calmed down, which signified dawn. They had been trapped in this strange cave for an entire night. Wen Kexing was not anxious either. He nodded at that. Seems like whoever lured you here, possibly on purpose, really wants you dead. Whoever lured you? Zhou Zishu replied. It's obviously you, I'm a good person. Wen Kexing wouldn't admit defeat. Zhou Zishu ignored him, grasping at the wall to stand up. He leaned on it and started calculating the way to escape. Wen Kexing asked by his side, aren't you afraid, Zhou Shu? I am, Zhou Zishu replied. Wen Kexing stared at him, slightly surprised. Zhou Zishu continued very seriously, I haven't gathered enough merits yet, if I enter hell now, who knows what I'll reincarnate into. Wen Kexing firmly said after some thought, you definitely weren't a good person before, then. He didn't wait for Zhou Zishu's reply, if that's the case, isn't it too late to start merit gathering now? Zhou Zishu straightened his back and walked toward a direction. Why? Haven't you heard of the saying the second you drop the knife is when you become Buddha? Wen Kexing chased after him. Where are you going? I'm going to eat dog meat, Zhou Zishu said, that person only traps us here. Traps you? Wen Kexing corrected. Zhou Zishu glanced at him with contempt, continuing, that beast's head is quite hefty, feasting on that is enough for us to last a few days. Without it there are still the underwater creatures, so we definitely won't starve. Doesn't matter who that person dressed in black is, they'll show themselves eventually. Wen Kexing said in horror, you were afraid of the dirty river water just yesterday, and now you want to eat those things that live in it? And are you going to starve yourself to death and let those things eat you instead? Zhou Zishu replied and concluded, how saintly of you, Brother Wen. The light couldn't reach the cave, but fortunately Zhou Zishu brought with him some lighters since he planned on escaping in the night. There was also a luminous pearl that he stole from the riches. The pearl was small but it was enough for them to move around. The faint light cast over half of his face, and Wen Kexing saw not the unpleasant features, but very bright eyes that were directed at him, carrying an indescribable hint of playfulness. That look was somewhat familiar. Wen Kexing thought long and hard about it, but he couldn't remember which beauty those eyes belonged to, so he stayed silent. In the moment when both of them said nothing, Zhou Zishu's ears caught the sound of a breath that was neither his nor Wen Kexing's. He smiled, as expected, someone was not feeling very patient right now. He then stood by the river and bent down to wash his hands, killing another monster that was sneakily attacking in the process. He lifted it up and threw it on the ground. The creature's neck broke and it drew its last breath without even making a sound. Zhou Zishu scooped up the water and drank leisurely. Wen Kexing, a carefree hooligan himself, stared at his companion thoughtfully before using the tip of his toe to kick the corpse away and drank the river water like the other. At that moment, a blade of wind came at them from behind. Wen Kexing dodged it by stepping aside, seemingly predicted it as he looked calm. A blade grazed his robes and fell into the water with a splash. Zhou Zishu laughed, his arms crossed as he stood to one side to enjoy the fun. See, Brother Wen, didn't I say that they're after you? And you're definitely not the good type either, seeing that they devote this much effort to deal with you. There were blades coming at him from every direction of the cave. Those blades completely went past Zhou Zishu to charge at Wen Kexing, creating a maze of weapons, but Wen Kexing didn't struggle at all, his Guangdong so much more skillful than Zhou Zishu had estimated. Internally, though, he was cursing, This Joe person was such a vengeful and petty one. Not only was he not good, he was utterly contemptible. Wen Kexing lifted his arm to bat away another blade, which brushed Zhou Zishu's pants and planted itself on the ground. Is leaving one to sink or swim your way of gathering merits, my beautiful Zhou? Chapter 14. Escape. Zhou Zishu looked him over before replying unhurriedly, I don't see how you're near death. He hadn't finished when Wen Kexing, as if responding, cried out in pain with his back bent. One of the blades pierced through his body to the hilt, and his face went pale as he could only utter, you. Zhou Zishu was initially shocked, but soon enough he rushed toward the opposite direction. In the corner was a fleeting shadow which caught Zhou Zishu's eyes thanks to the incredibly narrow path. The shadow was unable to dodge his attack in time, and they coughed up blood which stained their whole mask. They staggered back a few steps, but still had it in them to get back on their feet and run. There was an "oh" from Zhou Zishu as he realized the pine cone last time didn't stop them, not because he didn't put enough strength into it, but rather because this one was good at being a punching bag. All of a sudden, a ghostly figure appeared from nowhere to grab at the person's neck, propping them against the wall. The man in black said in horror, you. Wen Kexing tilted his head and smiled, his other arm raised. The blade, which was held under his armpit, fell to the ground. His clothes didn't suffer a single scratch. Zhou Zishu spoke in a lethargic manner, did you really believe his hoax? This is the first time I've seen a killer this dumb. At that, Wen Kexing looked at him thoughtfully. It's not that he's awful, your eyes are just way too sharp, my friend. If you aren't injured, he might. He cut himself off right there and shook his head, strengthening his grip on the black-clothed man's neck. There was a gurgling sound from his throat while his eyes shone with unspeakable fear. Wen Kexing felt his upper body with his other hand and hummed, gold-threaded armor. This is some good stuff, a shame that it's wasted on you. The man forced out broken words with great difficulty, Moss. Wen Kexing's lips curled, and with a crack, the man convulsed and went still. Zhou Zishu watched his companion killing off this person without any interrogating, his eyes darkened a little. He took one step back and leaned onto the wall, arms crossed while thinking about something. Wen Kexing removed the man's mask to completely reveal his identity. He looked around 40 with a small physique and high, cruel cheekbones. On his right cheek was a big red birthmark. His eyes were small, his nose was big, and he had buck teeth. Wen Kexing commented after examining, seeing how he looks, he deserves to die after all. Then he raised his head to smile at Zhou Zishu, do you agree, brother Zhou? Zhou Zishu replied, you're so full of nonsense. Wen Kexing held up his arms in a gesture of appreciation, I'm very incredibly honored that you thought of me so. Zhou Zishu laughed mockingly and went past him to look at the body. There were many burning questions inside him, such as, how did the famous golden armor, which disappeared from Zhonghu many years ago, end up in this person's hand? Was this one the true Shui Fang the hanged ghost? How were those underwater creatures made? Were they human? He undressed the corpse in a blink of an eye and found a daunting tattoo of a ghost face on his back. Zhou Zishu paused, he could be no one else but one of the ghosts. The hanged? Hanged ghost Shui Fang apparently had buck teeth. Ugh. This isn't right, and Zhou Zishu immediately abandoned this very Wen Kexing-like train of thought. Were those the actual ghosts that chased after him and Zhang Qingling along the way? Impossible, the ghosts of Quanju Ridge couldn't possibly make a name for themselves if that was all they could do. Why did the hanged ghost want to kill you, Tianji? And was the person who went the other way the delighted morning ghost? The act of killing renowned figures on the outskirt of the Zhao's holdings was a direct confirmation that they were the ones responsible for the Zhang family massacre. What good would it bring the Ghost Valley? And he looked up at an amiable Wen Kexing, questioning him suddenly, didn't brother Wen proclaim that you'd never murdered anyone ever since you left home? Why went against that just now? Wen Kexing glared. He wanted to end me first. If I hadn't been smart and clever enough, I would have died under those blades. Zhou Zishu smiled, were you also adamant that this disaster would never befall you, Mr. Good-hearted Wen? Wen Kexing replied with sense, look at this one and the ghost face on his back, then look at the young man we found, he lost his head before he could even get hitched. Don't you see? It proves the fact that this man was of the extremely vile sort. Did he need a reason to take the life of a good-hearted one? Zhou Zishu looked at him, not saying anything. Wen Kexing shook his head, voice full of conviction, how sad for an adult like you to be completely ignorant of such principles. I can't even imagine how you grew up. Zhou Zishu was silent for a good while. Then he spat out, grateful for the education. Wen Kexing was quick to reply, "It's nothing at all, don't be so formal." Zhou Zishu looked down, back to searching the body. While he was removing the armor, a small pouch fell out from the area near the chest. He carefully took it off, and found a sparkling piece of lapis lazuli inside. It was as big as the palm of his hand and meticulously crafted, seemingly engraved with patterns. He held up a broken piece to examine it under the light. "Lapis?" There was an awe from Wen Kexing as he took a closer look and received it from the other with both hands, as if he was afraid of breaking it. No wonder he wore the golden armor. I would have done the same if this was in my possession. Zhou Zishu was curious at the other man's serious attitude. "What is it?" He couldn't help but ask. Wen Kexing replied, "This looks like one of the 5 pieces that make up the legendary lapis armor. I thought them to be rumors, but seems like they're real after all. It's said that once you gather all 5 pieces, you will rule over the entire pugilist scene in Zhongyuan no matter who you are. Some say those pieces have the guide to the greatest martial art style hidden within them. Some say they hide a map instead, and when you follow the directions it will lead you to the object of your dreams and desires." He put it back in Zhou Zishu's palm somewhat reluctantly, curling the other's fingers around it. "It's the good stuff," he said softly. Zhou Zishu nodded in understanding, then immediately batting Wen Kexing's hand away. He put the piece of lapis back into the pouch and carelessly threw it aside to continue searching the hanged ghost body. After turning the corpse over and finding nothing else, he stood up with a frown. "Well, this is troublesome. How do we get out now?" He stared down upon the still sitting Wen Kexing, continuing in annoyance, "I'm asking you, Mr. Good Person Wen. You killed this man way too quickly. Do you want us to dig our way out like mice?" Wen Kexing pointed to the lapis. "You. Don't you want that?" Zhou Zishu replied with a solemn face, "If the completed piece is made of real lapis then it does worth a fortune, but there is only one part of it here so it's entirely useless. Not even the pawn shop would take this thing." At that, Wen Kexing laughed softly and stood up. He followed Zhou Zishu while asking, "Seeing how cautious Brother Zhou is, why won't you believe in the rumors? Don't you have any wishes or desires?" Zhou Zishu didn't bother to look back. "There is no such thing as a free lunch, and even you don't want it yourself, so why must I? Don't you have desires too, charitable Brother Wen?" Wen Kexing turned his head away at that, carefully putting the pouch in his chest pocket. "What if I want it?" he asked. Zhou Zishu glanced at him, then replied, "Ah." And nothing else. They walked back and forth in the cave, revisiting both the spot from where they jumped down and the entrance with blades sticking out. Zhou Zishu felt the wall surrounding them with his hands. This gate closed when we tried to get out, so at that time the hanged ghost was definitely near. The controlling mechanism might be around this spot too. But they were both completely clueless about divination, so the search was fruitless. The 7 nails started to stir slightly, informing Zhou Zishu that it was nearing midnight again. Another full day had passed with them trapped under here, and considering that he was in a worse condition than before, eating that dog-like beast might be inevitable. While they were thinking hard, all of a sudden, a faint voice could be heard from somewhere far away from the cave entrance. "Hurry up, I found this place, let me call out to them, Master. Master! Can you listen to me? Master, are you still breathing? If you are, I'm gonna dig you out of this grave, but if you want to go see the King of Hell, I won't bother you." It was Gu Xiong. For some unknown reasons, after being chased by a big dog, bitten by a monster, terrified by the hanged ghost's appearance, Zhou Zishu felt incredibly grateful for her voice. Gu Xiong continued to whisper, "Did you not hear me or are you dead already? Master, I'm gonna leave for real if you don't speak up." Only then did Wen Kexing speak up leisurely. "Ah Xiong, do you know what happens to girls who talk too much and do nothing? This seems to be a special kung fu of delivering sounds." Zhou Zishu had seen it from the other man several times. No matter where he was or how quiet he talked, he could make his target hear what he said very clearly. Gu Xiong made a whining sound, urging someone, "Hurry up, didn't you hear Master telling me to do more and talk less? Let's get him out of there." The sound of grave digging started afterward. Zhou Zishu suddenly realized, rather than not doing much, Gu Xiong just didn't do anything at all. It took nearly 4 hours to dig them out, like digging out 2 big turnips. Beside Gu Xiong was a crowd of men who looked like regular workers. She shouted, "Look! They're crawling out." Zhou Zishu didn't want to get out anymore at her words. Wen Kexing remained calm, making his way out with his face full of dirt and grime. He glanced at Gu Xiong, ordering her, "You can shut up now." Gu Xiong stuck out her tongue, making an ugly face at Zhou Zishu's direction. A worker walked towards them and formally greeted Wen Kexing, "Master, We're late. Gu Xiong cut in. We actually saw the marks you left behind long ago, but the Zeus made quite a ruckus since there were 2 mysterious deaths going on, and all those cowards who came here after that stalled our progress. How did you 2 end up like this, anyway? Wen Kexing replied, we saw a laughing owl. Zhou Zishu glanced at every other direction at once, like being dragged into this was the last thing he wanted. Huh? Gu Xiong asked confusedly. Wen Kexing explained, a laughing owl signifies incoming misfortune, including death. That's why we had to hide underground, that way the ghosts will think that we're already dead and they will leave us be. Oh. Gu Xiong exclaimed in enlightenment. Wen Kexing patted her head, continuing shamelessly, bear it in mind, it may save your life one day. Then he looked over to the worker-dressed man. Old Meng, these clothes don't suit you at all. Dress like a butcher next time. Old Meng replied dutifully, yes, master. Wen Kexing waved his hand, go, we don't need everyone gathering here and making people think that we're a gang of criminals. Old Meng whistled, and the rest disappeared into thin air in a very organized fashion, their traces completely vanishing. Zhou Zishu also said goodbye, but when Kexing told him, Brother Zhou, how about I follow you? Zhou Zishu used silence to proclaim his objection, only for Wen Kexing to continue, I'm a good man, so I can teach you the art of merit gathering on the way. Zhou Zishu remained silent. Gu Xiong, currently watching this staring contest, felt like the atmosphere had gone very strange. Eventually, Wen Kexing delivered the killing blow, and I'm gonna follow you whether you want me to or not. There was a stiff smile on Zhou Zishu's face as he replied, then be my guest, Brother Wen. Looking at Zhou Zishu, Gu Xiong finally understood what the saying a mule is only obedient when it received a beating one was all about. As for when she looked at Wen Kexing, she finally knew how a person could be so unabashed they would put the rest of the world to shame. She followed the 2 men, feeling extremely proud of herself for learning so much in just one night. Chapter 15. Tavern. Master, how are you so sure that once a person wears a disguise, it has to be uglier than how they normally are? Gu Xiong asked. Wen Kexing drawled, no matter how ugly or beautiful people look, the features they were born with have a harmonious quality to them. Once tweakings are made, it's impossible to not slip and make a mistake, and if you make yourself to be more beautiful, there will be more eyes on you, thus exposing those mistakes even more easily, understand? The 3 of them were walking on the main road that was full of people in the middle of noon. Zhou Zishu maintained his energy well by staying mute during the other 2's conversation and ignoring Wen Kexing's occasional secret looks thrown his way, but at those words, he couldn't help his surprise. This man sure knows a lot, he glanced at Wen Kexing and thought. Being the center of attention gave a boost to Wen Kexing's ego as he continued to ramble on. The art of disguise is vast with varying methods. Some paint over their face, this method requires fastidiousness as the smallest inconsistency will out them. Some craft a human skin-like mask, this one is way more effective and harder to detect if the disguiser is good at his job. He spared a quick look at Zhou Zishu at that. Gu Xiong immediately applied what she had been taught by feeling Zhou Zishu's face with her fingers. Her hands were soft, and around her sleeves was a refreshing fragrance that could only belong to a young maiden. Zhou Zishu made no attempt to dodge, instead he only laughed and let her do what she wanted. No one knew who was taking advantage of who at this point. He asked softly and patiently after a while, have you found anything? Gu Xiong's expression was full of doubt. She looked back to Wen Kexing skeptically, Master, I still feel like it's real. Wen Kexing replied, of course he won't wear a human skin mask, that thing leaves no room for the skin under to breathe. He would have to remove it after a certain amount of time, which is why I'm sticking to him, to see if he will do it. There was idolization on Gu Xiong's face. So you wasted this much time fooling around just because you want an answer to that. Wen Kexing pointed at Zhou Zishu, if he is a beauty, I'm definitely not wasting anything. After mulling things over, Zhou Zishu decided he could stay silent no longer. Since when was I fooling around with you? Wen Kexing answered unhurriedly, not now, but you definitely will in the future. Then he also reached out to touch Zhou Zishu's face. That time when I touched the skin on your shoulder, the feeling was different. Zhou Zishu batted his hand away as he stepped back. Wen Kexing raised his brows in discontent, pointing at Gu Xiong, how can she touch you but I can't? Zhou Zishu casually fixed his torn sleeves. If you can look like her, I'm willing to strip off everything so you can touch however much you like. Gu Xiong once thought Zhou Zishu was a poor beggar who was too unfortunate to have run into her master and even sympathized with him, but after that reply she realized they were just birds of a same damn feather, no wonder they flocked together. She could only hope now that they had each other to mess around and fight their energy away with, they would cause less disaster for the world. Wen Kexing turned to Judge Gu Xiang with an unreadable face. Then his voice dropped, "Ah Xiang, you can get lost now." There was a huh? From Gu Xiang as she blinked innocently. "You want me to be off to where?" Wen Kexing crossed his arms, really wishing to see her no more. "This world is endless, except for Dongting, you can scram to wherever." Gu Xiang, after a good while of standing there foolishly, blurted out, "Are you jealous with me, master?" Wen Kexing glanced at her. Gu Xiang immediately understood and slapped herself. "Damn you, you stupid mouth, you stupid running mouth, how about? Ah Xiang." Gu Xiang walked away immediately with an aish, continuing to ramble along the way. Alright, I'll scram. Don't worry master, I'll leave to the farthest place I can. A three-legged frog may be hard to find but not a two-legged man. Never in my life would I dare to steal your men, master, please, you two just be my guest, carry on with what you're doing." She quickly disappeared from view, still prattling on. Zhou Zishu watched this squabble between master and maid with interest, thinking back to the except for Dongting part, which seemed to carry a deeper meaning. Once Gu Xiang left, Wen Kexing's entire demeanor changed. He coughed pretentiously, extending his hand. "Can this one have the honor of having a meal with you, Brother Zhou? Even if I refuse, this person will tail me around anyway," Zhou Zishu thought, "and if I agree he will pay for my food." He accepted the request quite cheerfully. Wen Kexing led the way with the brightest face. Zhou Zishu did an internal introspection. Back when he was a half-ghost flitting about the palace, wearing robes and doing murderous business in a mysterious place full of apricot blossoms, he might be brutal, but at least there was a grace to him as a cover. Since when had he become unabashedly shameless? He looked at Wen Kexing's back and thought, a man is known by the company he keeps indeed. They were starving when they reached the tavern, so all the dishes were consumed with silent efficiency, as if they were afraid they would miss a bite. Their chopsticks bumped occasionally and small fights ensued over chicken and pork. One food admirer and one free meal enthusiast turned the table into a full-blown battle with heavy murderous atmosphere. After winning one plate to himself, Wen Kexing smiled at Zhou Zishu while waiting for the next dish. "I've met my match, no wonder why this meal has become so much more delicious." Zhou Zishu looked at him scornfully. "What are you, a chicken? Why all this fighting?" At that moment, there was a commotion on the lower floor. A waiter taunted loudly, "Hey, young master, you sure dress and behave well, why do you want to dine and dash? And the prepayment letter nonsense too, you must have heard too many stories. Which court scholar are you then? Are you a principal graduate, and if so, which examination did you ace in? And the calligraphy?" The crowd around them laughed. Wen Kexing stuck his head out to look at the scene under them, rubbing his chin while whispering, "A beauty." Zhou Zishu followed his gaze. Downstairs was a flustered young man wearing dark blue clothes, a xiao by his hip. His clothes didn't stand out at first glance, but when one took a closer look, the materials were incredibly exquisite. The jade xiao was also finely crafted. Even if he wasn't an expert, he knew it must have cost a fortune. Zhou Zishu felt a sense of familiarity in the way he dressed and laughed quietly. Wen Kexing asked, "What are you laughing at?" He tries to dress inconspicuously but ends up doing a terrible job of it. He reminds me of someone I knew. While they were talking, the ignorant young man surrounded by the crowd looked up, his eyes glossing over them. Zhou Zishu shook his head. He surely must be of the most distinguished nobility. Someone well versed in dissipated behaviors would never have that doe-eyed look to him. "Brother Wen, your chance for merit gathering has come." Wen Kexing, initially watching his companion's expression, was startled at that, hand rummaging in his chest pocket. "Yeah, you have a point, it's a must-do-aid, a beauty in need." He stopped dead in his track, face strange. "Brother Wen." "Huh? I was thinking, how about you do it instead?" Wen Kexing smiled awkwardly. "I myself have done a lot in my lifetime, there's no need to steal your moment." Zhou Zishu beamed at him. After a few seconds, Wen Kexing sighed, shoulders sagging. "Back when we were on the street, I helped a dashing man when he tripped and fell, he even smiled at me too. Ha! How could I ever know that a person with such charm turned out to be a thief?" Zhou Zishu raised his brows, deciding that he should be even more shameless. He would not be beaten by this person. His mind made up, he conveniently tugged at Wen Kexing's sleeves to wipe his hand on them, then took out a silver ingot from his chest and threw it downstairs without any strength. It hit the increasingly offensive waiter on the head. The man was going to yell at whoever did that, but his anger vanished once he picked up the object and realized it was shiny silver. He heard Zhou Zishu's lazy drawl, "Put him on my tab." Naturally, the waiter shut up, his head lowered with words of affirmation. The young man in blue clothes immediately looked at Zhou Zishu gratefully and went upstairs to thank the other in person. Zhou Zishu pointed at the table that was now empty of food and said to Wen Kexing, "Saving him is on me, this meal is on you. Write that down, you owe me 3 silver liangs now." Wen Kexing spoke in a small voice, "Can I use my body to pay back the debt?" Zhou Zishu smiled, unruffled. "Sorry, my taste is not that refined yet." The young man had reached where they were sitting. Both hid away their sneaky smiles and displayed the most heroic demeanor possible. The young man bowed deeply. "My name is Cao Whining, please receive this gesture as my token of deepest gratitude for your help." Wen Kexing and Zhou Zishu both spoke at the same time. "It's nothing, young Master Cao, there's no need to be so formal." They glanced at each other meaningfully afterwards, basking in the peculiarity of the situation. Zhou Zishu coughed and looked away first. "Please sit, young Master Cao. My name is Zhou Shu, and this one is Wen Kexing." The other smiled and nodded. He sat quietly and a bit distantly from them, his behavior is the perfect image of a gentleman. After thanking them, Cao Whining sat down without a doubt. He was a closed-door disciple from Qing Feng's sword sect, and this was his first time experiencing life in Zhonghu. He got separated from his uncle master and unknowingly ran into a thief, which was why he was in this embarrassing situation. He was well and truly clueless about what to do until Zhou Zishu's rescue. Consequently, he deemed this person to be such a righteous individual, even his sickly face didn't seem that grotesque at all to him. Taking advantage of situations was Zhou Zishu's strongest point. His skills worked on everyone except for Wen Kexing. Only a few sentences into the conversation and Cao Whining already felt like they were the closest of comrades as he started telling the other everything possible. "My uncle master and I are attending the gathering in Dongting, but a few days ago something awful happened back at the Zhao's holdings. My uncle and Sir Zhao knew each other way back, so he told me to go to Dongting first to apologize to Sir Gao Chong for being late." "Dongting's gathering?" Zhou Zishu was surprised. "Yes." Cao Whining explained, "Has Brother Zhou heard about the Zhang family tragedy? Not only that, I heard a few days ago the patriarch of Taishan died mysteriously in his own room along with all of his disciples in one single night, in a fashion not unlike the Sangs. The lucky Zhang young master who survived is now with the Zayas and under Sir Zhao's protection." He confirmed that the ghosts of Quanju Ridge were behind this. This gathering at Dongting is summoned by Sir Gao using his realm's command, aiming to gather all the heroes in the world to extinguish the Ghost Valley. On instinct, Zhou Zishu glanced at Wen Kexing, only to find the man deeply invested in the conversation. He even asked, "Is this real?" "Absolutely." Cao Whining replied. "Uncle and I are under my master's order to attend." Sure enough, this youngling was someone experiencing real life for the first time. He answered questions he wasn't even asked. Wen Kexing said, "Isn't gathering merits your goal, Brother Zhou? How about accompanying this young friend? Battling evils is surely one of the biggest virtues out there." Zhou Zishu took a sip of wine with his eyes downcast, unsure about Wen Kexing's motives. Cao Whining clapped his hands. "Indeed it is, that was very well said of you, Brother Wen. I think you two are very righteous and honorable and that we can be great friends, so why don't you come with me to Dongting?" "Ha, this foolish kid." Wen Kexing smiled, "That'd be our honor."